Imagine for a moment, you're a leader. You're facing a really tough decision. It's one of those, promises some sweet short-term gains, maybe a quick boost to the bottom line, or immediate popularity.
Right, the tempting option.
Exactly. But deep down, you kind of know it might compromise your core values. Or even worse, the well-being of your team, maybe the entire future of your organization.
Yeah, the stakes can be incredibly high.
How do you actually decide in that moment? What guides you when there's no clear-cut rule book and the stakes are just, well, incredibly high?
That's the core question, isn't it?
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What truly defines a good leader?
Yeah.
Beyond just their achievements or how popular they seem.
That's precisely the challenge, and it's why we're doing this deep dive today into the fascinating world of ethical leadership.
Okay.
Our mission really is to go beyond just the simple rules or, compliance checklists. We want to truly explore what it means to lead ethically.
So more than just ticking boxes.
Much more. We'll unpack the internal character, the mindset, and the external practices that all come together to create a truly impactful and, importantly, moral leader. This isn't just about avoiding doing wrong things. It's about actively striving for the greater good, shaping not just outcomes, but the very people and culture around you.
Okay, let's unpack this. As we looked into these sources, I was genuinely struck by how ancient wisdom finds echoes in cutting-edge modern psychology. It's quite amazing.
It really is. The continuity is remarkable.
We've pulled together a really rich stack of material for this deep dive. We've got foundational principles like the FATHER framework, which is a really helpful acronym for core values. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
Then there's the timeless insights of virtue ethics. We'll also explore the incredibly practical philosophy of servant leadership.
And it gets really interesting when we bring in the modern psychological research, stuff on leader integrity, moral identity. It almost felt like missing pieces clicking into place when you see it all together.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to make these concepts tangible, really bring them to life, we're going to put them to the test.
Right.
We have a series of specific real-world case studies, and these are drawn from the education sector.
Which is such a critical area for this discussion.
Exactly. These dilemmas will really challenge you, the listener, to think about how these principles actually apply in these high-stakes environments where, the well-being and future of young people are quite literally on the line.
So what does this all mean for you listening?
Well, it's about a really profound idea, I think. Ethical leadership isn't just about doing the right things. It's about being the right kind of leader.
Being, not just doing. I like that.
It's about cultivating character and a mindset that inherently seeks the greater good. It's about setting yourself and those you lead on a path toward true excellence.
All right, let's begin. Moving on from our initial overview, our sources lay out some fundamental definitions. When we talk about ethical leadership, what exactly are we defining? Well, the sources frame it quite nicely, I thought. They call it the art of leading people and making good decisions based on a defined set of values.
The art of leading. Interesting.
Yes, it implies skill, practice, nuance. It's fundamentally about distinguishing right from wrong, using a set of moral principles that you've hopefully intentionally adopted.
Okay, so establishing clear values is the foundation.
Exactly. That's the core foundation for practicing ethical leadership for yourself and for your organization. But, in reality, how hard is that?
It sounds simple on paper.
Right. Don't most organizations think they have clear values? Maybe up on a poster somewhere, only to find them crumbling under pressure.
Yeah, when push comes to shove.
Our sources suggest that without a clearly articulated, deeply internalized internal compass, decisions can become arbitrary or reactive rather than truly principled. This isn't just a theoretical exercise, it's about building a solid bedrock for consistent ethical action, especially when the path isn't clear or easy.
That brings us to a really helpful mnemonic device from our sources, the FATHER framework for ethical leadership.
FATHER.
Yes. It lays out 6 key values that form the principles we should strive for: fairness, accountability, trust, honesty, equality, and respect.
It's a powerful way to remember those core tenets, and each one, as you dig in, has some surprising depth to it.
Okay, let's unpack a few of these because their practical implications are are often overlooked, aren't they?
Definitely. Take fairness. Our sources highlight that it's not just about treating everyone equally in some abstract sense. It's about treating people consistently in similar situations.
Consistency, that's key.
It really is. The most damaging breach isn't always, blatant favoritism. It's often the subtle, inconsistent application of rules. Like when one person gets a pass on a deadline, but another is reprimanded for the exact same thing, maybe because the manager likes them less or they're having a bad day.
I could see how that would erode morale fast.
Absolutely. That inconsistency, our sources say, breeds contempt faster than almost anything else. It completely destroys psychological safety within a team. People start watching their backs, wondering if the rules apply to them today.
Yeah, okay. And accountability is next. This one really speaks to moral fiber, doesn't it?
It does. We all make mistakes. It's human. But our nature often pushes us to, blame others, blame circumstances, point fingers.
Or blame games.
Exactly. Our sources highlight that accepting accountability for bad decisions or errors, genuinely owning it, shows a strong character that people truly respect and, frankly, will follow. It's about owning your choices, acknowledging your role. That strength builds immense respect.
It's the difference between a leader who says mistakes were made versus I made a mistake. Huge difference.
A world of difference.
Yeah.
Then we have trust. This is described as the bedrock of great relationships and high-performing teams.
Bedrock. That sounds fundamental.
It is. Whether you're looking at military units, sports teams, corporate environments, you name it, trust is essential. Without it, a team will simply, it'll tear itself apart. It descends into infighting, backstabbing, inefficiency.
And honesty feeds into that directly.
Directly. Honesty is the currency of trust. You can't build trust without it. It's absolutely foundational.
I can see how honesty builds trust, but in practice, how do leaders navigate those difficult truths? The sources suggest it's not just about bluntness, but open and honest discussion. Can you elaborate on what discussion entails when the truth might be painful or unpopular?
That's a really important question. It means creating a space, a psychological safety net where important issues can be discussed openly and honestly, but always with respect.
So not just dropping a truth bomb and walking away.
Definitely not. It's about bringing people into the conversation, explaining the why, listening to their reactions, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. Because if you can't be truly honest with someone, you can't truly trust them to hear your full perspective or, importantly, contribute their own honest perspective back.
Right.
This open dialogue, even when challenging, is what builds the integrity of relationships. It shows you respect people enough to level with them.
Okay. The E in father stands for equality. And this is framed pretty strongly, core to our global human survival and happiness.
It is strongly framed, and rightly so. Our sources emphasize that discrimination in any form, whether it's based on color, faith, gender, sexual orientation, background, any superficial difference, is not just morally wrong, it's deeply destructive.
Destructive how?
Well, beyond the obvious harm to individuals, it prevents teams, organizations, even societies from reaching their full potential. It prevents true enlightenment, as one source puts it. They share an anecdote about growing up in central England in the 1970s, finding mixed-race school environments totally natural and racist names just bizarre. It underscores that discrimination isn't inherent, it's learned, and it will only breed contempt.
It actively holds us back.
Precisely. It's about recognizing the shared humanity in everyone and realizing that prejudice prevents us from benefiting from the full spectrum of talent and perspective available.
And finally, respect. The R.
Respect. This means showing regard for the wishes, feelings, and rights of others. Critically, you might not agree with someone's feelings or opinions, but you must respect their right to have them.
That's a key distinction. Respecting the person even if you disagree with their view.
Exactly. True understanding involves appreciating differences and, ideally, finding something to admire in everyone, even those you find challenging. Our sources say this builds admiration, which makes perfect sense. It's not just about tolerating differences. It's about genuinely valuing the unique contributions and perspectives of others.
What's fascinating here, the overarching insight from this father framework, is that ethical leadership is not about doing the right things. It's about doing the right things the right way.
Yes, the how matters tremendously.
It emphasizes the process, the approach, as much as the outcome.
But why is the how so often overlooked, especially when the pressure is on? Our sources suggest that leaders often fall into the trap of prioritizing outcomes over process, right?
They do. They forget that a right decision delivered the wrong way, without fairness, without respect, without honesty, can still erode trust completely. Think about a necessary layoff, for example. It might be financially unavoidable, the right business decision in a narrow sense.
Yeah.
But if it's handled callously, without empathy or transparency,
It destroys morale and loyalty. Exactly. Is that truly the right way? The damage done by the how can outweigh any benefit from the what.
precisely. It's a powerful distinction. And it becomes incredibly stark, tragically so, when we look at real-world examples. Because despite all these noble principles,
Here comes the reality check.
right, our sources remind us of the frustrating reality. Corporate scandals are a persistent shadow. They often expose a huge gap between the stated values, the glossy posters, the mission statements, and actual leader behavior.
So many large companies boast impressive standards of business conduct, these beautiful documents outlining their values. But in the real world, what's on paper and how leaders actually behave are, sadly, often two very different things.
Unfortunately, yes. We have concrete examples from the sources that really illustrate this gap. Take the HP spying scandal back in 2006.
Ah, yes, that was a big one.
The board chair, Patricia Dunn, actually breached the company's own moral code by initiating unlawful spying on other board members and journalists to uncover information leaks.
Unlawful spying by the chair.
Yeah, that's a leader at the very top, engaging in deeply unethical, even illegal behavior, completely undermining any notion of trust or respect.
And it didn't stop there at HP, did it? Mark Hurd, another HP CEO.
Right, he was known for really radical redundancies and cost-cutting. He even asked staff to take a 5% pay cut at one point.
Belt tightening for everyone, except perhaps himself.
Well, he himself resigned in 2010 after an investigation found he was cheating on expense claims, hiding personal expenses as business costs.
Wow, the hypocrisy is just stunning. It really makes you wonder about the integrity at the very top, doesn't it? That kind of behavior completely undermines any stated values.
And these aren't just isolated incidents, are they? The research cited is quite alarming.
It is. Research from the Institute of Leadership and Management showed, get this, 63% of managers have been asked to do something contrary to their ethical code.
Over half.
Yes. 43% have been told to violate their organization's values. And maybe most shockingly, 9%, nearly 1 in 10, have even been asked to break the law by their superiors.
It's the law. That's incredible.
And it has real consequences. Annually, an average of 4 corporate scandals lead to a company's complete insolvency. Gone. Kaput. These figures underscore a deep, systemic issue.
So, with all that as context, why should you, the listener, strive for ethical leadership? Especially when examples like these exist, when the pressure is on, when it feels like the unethical path is sometimes rewarded.
Because you are better than that. Because you stand for something. Because you have integrity, and real integrity gets you a long way, even if it doesn't always feel like the fastest route in the short term. It's about setting a different standard.
It's also about how decisions are made, right? Our sources touch on 2 major competing ethical theories that often play out in these scenarios: duty-based ethics and utilitarianism.
Right. Duty-based ethics, or deontology, is like a rule book. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. If you break the rule, you're in breach. Most company codes of conduct lean heavily this way, do this, don't do that.
Clear rules. And the other approach.
That's the utilitarian approach, or consequentialism. This judges a decision based on its consequences, aiming for the greatest good or the least pain for the greatest number of people. It's less about the rule itself and more about the outcome.
And our sources provide a really compelling example of these 2 approaches playing out during the 2008 auto industry crisis. The difference between the American and German responses was stark.
It really was. In the American approach, which seemed largely duty-based, a duty perhaps primarily to shareholders or the survival of the corporate entity, the giants of the U.S. auto industry quickly slashed vast swaths of their workforce.
Because they could. Legally.
Exactly. U.S. workers generally had minimal employment rights compared to Germany, so it was relatively easy to implement mass redundancies and just ramp down production. General Motors and Chrysler still needed a government bailout to survive, but the impact on society was immense. Ghost towns, huge unemployment, poverty, destitution. The decision seemed based on a duty to keep the company afloat, often at the expense of everything else.
Okay, so that's the duty-based, rule-following approach, with devastating consequences for many. What about the German approach?
The German approach leaned much more heavily into utilitarianism, minimizing the overall pain. Their labor market is more protected, requiring severance packages based on an employee's social situation, making mass layoffs much harder and more expensive.
So what did they do instead?
Instead of mass layoffs, German car assemblers asked people to voluntarily move to part-time employment during the recession. This still achieved the goal of slashing labor costs significantly, but it didn't create the same kind of social implosion seen in the U.S.
So people took a hit but kept their jobs.
Yes. The workers absorbed a reduced income and made cutbacks, but it was framed as being for the greater good. They didn't lose their homes, they didn't lose their connection to employment entirely. There was social cohesion in a time of difficulty, no widespread poverty or social disintegration on the same scale.
And the long-term outcome.
The outcome was that German automakers, like Volkswagen, could bounce back much more quickly when the economy recovered because they had maintained their entire skilled workforce. VW eventually became the largest car maker in the world. It's a powerful illustration of how different ethical frameworks lead to vastly different societal outcomes, and how prioritizing the least pain can actually lead to better long-term business results, not just social ones.
That's a fascinating comparison, truly showing the least pain principle in action and, well, the long-term benefits of a more ethical, perhaps more holistic approach. And when we think about ethical leadership role models who embody these principles, our sources point strongly to Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, Lincoln comes up as a powerful example. His existence is described as a true gift to humanity because of his fight for equality and his incredible will to bring people together for the greater good, even amidst unimaginable conflict.
How did he exemplify these father principles we talked about?
Well, think about respect, trust, and honesty. He had this amazing capacity to listen to different points of view. He actively fostered a climate where his cabinet members, often his political rivals, felt free to disagree, even vehemently, without fear of retaliation.
That takes real confidence and respect.
It does. Yet he also knew when the discussion had run its course and it was time to make a final decision. He didn't avoid difficult conversations. He leaned into them, knowing they were essential for robust decision-making.
And what about accountability?
Lincoln famously stood up for his cabinet members when mistakes were made. There's an instance cited where, regarding some war effort contract issues, he basically indicates that he and his entire cabinet were to blame.
Wow, not throwing them under the bus.
Quite the opposite. That's a leader owning not just his own potential failures, but his team's, which builds immense loyalty and psychological safety. It's a profound act of courage and accountability.
In his commitment to equality.
Unshakable. The example given is the summer of 1864. The war wasn't going well, politically things were dicey, and members of his own political party were urging him to compromise on the issue of slavery to secure peace or political advantage.
A huge pressure point.
Immense. But Lincoln held firm. He turned away from that advice, demonstrating unwavering integrity and commitment to the principle of equality, even when it was politically expedient, maybe even politically necessary, some thought, to do otherwise.
And that famous quote from his second inaugural address, "With malice toward none, with charity for all.
Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." Yes, it beautifully captures his respect and integrity, a vision for unity and healing that transcended the immediate conflict, looking towards a just and lasting peace.
These historical examples really underscore that ethical leadership isn't just about abstract principles on a page. It's about how leaders live their values day in, day out, especially when it's hard.
Absolutely, and it has tangible benefits. A study mentioned from Cornell University found that ethical leadership was positively and significantly related to employee performance. It's not just nice to have, it actually builds high-performing, respectful, and motivated teams.
Why is that, do you think?
Because people are inherently drawn to work for someone they trust, someone they believe has integrity, someone who treats them fairly and with respect. It taps into a fundamental human need for fairness and meaning in our work.
So if you're a leader listening to this, whether you're a CEO or a team manager or even just influencing colleagues, you can start your own movement, right? By living these values.
Definitely. Our sources even suggest a practical step. Hold a team workshop using these father principles. Split your team into groups. Assign each group one of the principles: fairness, accountability, trust, honesty, equality, respect. Have them interpret what it means in your specific workplace context and come up with practical, everyday examples of how to live it.
Making it real for the team.
Exactly. And after the workshop, you can establish clear ground rules for team interactions, explicitly connected back to these values.
Like what kind of ground rules?
Things like, We do not play politics, meaning no bending the truth, no undermining colleagues, no hidden agendas. We always treat each other with respect, ensuring no raised voices, no aggressive behavior, no dismissiveness or rudeness, even in disagreements.
Basic decency, really, but explicitly stated.
Explicit stated and agreed upon. Also, we do not talk behind other people's backs. This fosters a positive atmosphere where issues are addressed directly and constructively.
That's a big one. What else?
We operate with openness and honesty, but always doing so with respect, linking back to that earlier point. And crucially, we are here to support and trust each other. If someone on the team is struggling, the expectation is the whole team steps up to help rather than letting them fail.
Creating a safety net.
Precisely. And finally, we will manage opportunities, successes, and failures fairly, with a commitment that individual success is team success. No one should be left behind. It's about building a collective integrity that ripples through the entire organization, creating a culture of trust and shared responsibility.
Okay, so far we've talked a lot about the external principles and values, the father framework, the sort of compass that guides ethical leaders. But as our sources suggest, just knowing the rules isn't enough, is it?
Not even close.
What happens when the path isn't clear? When rules conflict? Or when doing the right thing is incredibly difficult or costly?
That's where the deeper inner work begins. It's about the cultivation of character. And this brings us to the fascinating world of virtue ethics.
Virtue ethics.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the core idea here?
Here, a virtue is defined not just as a good quality, but as a habit of the mind, the will, and the heart, which allows us to achieve personal excellence.
A habit that leads to excellence.
Exactly. And what's crucial here is the distinction our sources make. While values are what a person considers important, and traits might describe natural dispositions you're born with, virtues are consciously chosen and actively worked at.
So you choose to be virtuous.
You choose it and you practice it. Virtues are intentionally selected, deliberately strengthened, and behaviorally predictive. This means you decide, I want to be more courageous, or I need to cultivate more patience. And then you actively work on developing that quality until it becomes part of who you are.
So it's about who you are becoming, not just what rules you follow.
Precisely. It shifts the focus inward to the development of the person, the leader.
This philosophical tradition goes way back, doesn't it?
Way back. We trace this wisdom back to Aristotle. His idea of eudaimonia, often translated as human flourishing or living well achieved through practicing virtues like prudence, courage, temperance, and justice. These aren't just dusty philosophical concepts.
They feel relevant today.
Startlingly relevant. Aristotle suggested true leadership, true flourishing, isn't about power or wealth, but about cultivating internal excellence. These virtues. His work laid the groundwork that still informs our understanding of character today. Later figures like Thomas Aquinas further developed the system, often from a Christian perspective.
But then things shifted.
Yes, with the modern era, particularly the Enlightenment, the pendulum swung away from virtue ethics. The focus shifted towards those ethical systems we mentioned earlier, duty-based ethics, or deontology, think Kantianism or the Ten Commandments. These are about external rules you must follow.
Obey the rules.
Right. And then there's consequence-based ethics, or utilitarianism, what actions will bring the greatest good for the greatest number. The key here is that both these dominant modern approaches focus primarily on external ethical considerations, the act itself or its consequences. Virtue ethics looks inward at the character of the actor.
But you mentioned the pendulum is swinging back.
It is, yes. As is so often the case. Virtue ethics is now gaining significant attention, again, across philosophy, sociology, business, and even fields like medicine.
Why now, do you think?
Perhaps a recognition that rules and consequences alone aren't enough. Maybe a sense that we need leaders of good character, not just leaders who follow procedures or aim for certain outcomes. This resurgence highlights a renewed appreciation for the importance of character in ethical leadership, recognizing that true, consistent ethical behavior likely stems from a well-developed internal compass, not just external constraints or calculations.
Okay, so if virtue ethics is about character, what are the key virtues for leaders according to these sources?
This is where it gets really interesting. Our sources highlight two virtues as the very essence of leadership itself. Not just helpful, but the essence. These are magnanimity and fraternal humility.
Magnanimity and fraternal humility. Tell me more. What's magnanimity?
Magnanimity is described as the habit of striving for great things. Think big-heartedness, greatness of soul. It manifests in leaders who have grand dreams, compelling visions, a strong sense of mission. It's their capacity to challenge themselves and those around them to reach higher, to attempt great things.
So the visionary aspect of leadership.
Exactly. It's about being aspirational, aiming high, having that fire in the belly.
And fraternal humility, that sounds almost like the opposite.
It's the perfect counterpart, actually. It's defined as the habit of serving others. This means pulling rather than pushing, teaching rather than ordering about, inspiring rather than berating.
Leading from beside or behind rather than just from the front.
Precisely. Leaders embodying fraternal humility become educators, masters, coaches. They empower others to realize their full human potential, even to become leaders themselves. It's about service, development, uplifting others.
So together, this magnanimity, the grand vision and fraternal humility, the service to others, form the essence of leadership.
That's what the sources propose. What stands out to you about that pairing? It feels almost contradictory on the surface, doesn't it? Grand vision coupled with deep service.
It does seem paradoxical. How can you be focused on great things for yourself or the mission and simultaneously focused on serving others?
And that's precisely the power of it, according to this view. It's not either, but both hand. A leader needs that broad vision, that magnanimity, to set a meaningful direction, to inspire people towards something worthwhile. But without fraternal humility, that vision can become dictatorial, arrogant, or detached from the people needed to achieve it.
So humility grounds the vision.
Exactly. Humility ensures the leader remains connected to those they serve, understanding their needs, developing their potential, pulling them up rather than just pushing them around. It balances aspiration with deep care and respect for others. It prevents the vision from becoming self-serving.
That makes a lot of sense. So that's the essence. What about the foundations?
Beneath that essence, we have the traditional cardinal virtues as the foundations of leadership. First is prudence, often called practical wisdom. This enhances a leader's ability to make the right decisions by discerning the virtuous action in each specific, often messy situation.
So not just knowing the rules, but knowing how to apply them wisely.
Exactly. Aristotle considered it the ultimate virtue because it guides all the others. It's about making wise choices in the complex reality of leadership, not just in theory.
Okay, prudence. What's next?
Next is courage. This is crucial for taking necessary risks, for speaking truth to power, and for staying the course amidst challenges and adversity. It enables the leader to do what the world expects of him, or what needs to be done, even when it's difficult, unpopular, or frightening.
And this isn't just physical courage.
Not at all. Think of the moral courage required to challenge deeply entrenched, unethical corporate norms, or to make a stand on principle when it might cost you personally or professionally. That's often harder than physical bravery.
Then there's self-mastery, or temperance.
Yes, this virtue allows leaders to subordinate their emotions and passions to the mission, directing their vital energy purposefully. It's about maintaining calmness, composure, and rational thought, especially in high-pressure situations or when provoked.
But isn't there a risk that self-mastery could lead to a leader appearing cold, emotionally distant, rather than just composed? How do our sources define that balance?
That's a great point and a common misconception. Our sources highlight that self-mastery isn't about suppressing emotions entirely or becoming some kind of robot. It's about directing them effectively.
Directing, not denying.
Exactly. It means you feel the pressure, you feel the frustration, maybe even the anger or the excitement, but you don't let those emotions hijack your judgment or lead to impulsive, destructive decisions. It's channeling that energy purposefully, maintaining inner composure so you can lead effectively from a place of reason and mission focus, rather than just reacting emotionally. It allows for intentional, thoughtful responses.
Okay, that clarifies it. And the last cardinal virtue?
Justice. This impels leaders to give everyone his due, ensuring fairness and equity in all decisions and actions. This ties directly back to the fairness and equality principles in the Father framework, showing how these concepts interweave and reinforce each other.
But what does giving everyone his due truly mean in practice? Especially when resources are scarce or competing demands are high. That's where ethical leadership gets really complex, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and that's where prudence comes back in. Justice, in this context, means making decisions that are not only impartial, but also consider the unique needs, contributions, and circumstances of each person or group, ensuring that outcomes are equitable, even if they aren't strictly equal in a mathematical sense. It's a constant balancing act, demanding that practical wisdom of prudence to navigate those complexities fairly.
Okay, prudence, courage, self-mastery, justice. Foundational. But you mentioned something even more foundational.
Yes, according to these sources, even more foundational than the cardinal virtues is fundamental humility. This isn't quite the same as the fraternal humility we discussed earlier. This is described as the habit of living in the truth about oneself, or simply self-knowledge.
Knowing yourself.
Deeply knowing yourself, your strengths, yes, but also crucially, your weaknesses, your biases, your blind spots, your triggers. This self-awareness is truly the foundation of leadership. Because without knowing yourself accurately, how can you possibly lead others effectively, justly, or even prudently? Your own unacknowledged flaws or biases will inevitably distort your decisions and relationships.
Wow. Okay, so if character, built on these virtues, is so central, does that mean leaders are just born with it
Yeah.
or not?
Our sources emphatically challenge the leaders are born myth. They strongly emphasize that virtue is a habit acquired through practice. Leadership, therefore, is primarily a matter of character, which is a predisposition developed through intentional training and effort rather than just temperament, which is more like the native predisposition you're born with.
That's incredibly empowering, isn't it? It means leadership isn't some mystical quality bestowed on a chosen few. It can be learned, cultivated, strengthened by anyone willing to put in the work.
Exactly. It democratizes leadership in a sense. And the sources outline two primary methods for developing these virtues.
How we do it?
First, emulation of exemplars. You consciously choose someone who models a virtue you wish to develop. Maybe it's a mentor or a respected colleague, a historical figure, even a close friend or teacher. You study how they act, how they respond in certain situations, and you consciously try to imitate their behavior.
Learning by watching and copying the best.
It's a powerful form of learning, almost like having a living blueprint or a virtue coach.
And the second method.
The second method is habitual practice. This is about actively, repeatedly engaging in virtuous actions until they become ingrained, until they become consistent, unthinking responses, almost like muscle memory for your character.
You know, that idea of habitual practice reminds me of learning any new skill, like trying to cook without a recipe for the first time or learning a golf swing. It's awkward, conscious, maybe even messy at first.
Absolutely.
But with repetition, with conscious effort over time, it becomes smoother, more natural, almost second nature. It's the same for virtues, isn't it?
It absolutely is. The sources give some great practical examples. Instead of automatically expressing annoyance or displeasure when a meeting is unexpectedly canceled, you mindfully, consciously choose to respond calmly and flexibly. Or instead of reflexively checking your phone when someone is giving a long, maybe rambling explanation, you mindfully choose to remain attentive and present until they're finished.
Small, deliberate acts.
Small, deliberate acts practiced consistently. The more you consciously practice these behaviors, the more they become ingrained. Eventually, the conscious effort fades and it transforms into effortless excellence, your default response.
And this notion is beautifully captured in that quote from Will Durant, often misattributed to Aristotle. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit.
Precisely. It really drives home the idea that consistent, intentional effort builds character over time. Excellence isn't born, it's built habit by habit.
And there's a really compelling analogy used to illustrate this potential for training character.
Yes, the analogy drawn from post-World War II military reports, it's quite striking. These reports apparently show that initially, perhaps only 15% of infantry soldiers in combat actually fired their weapons, and even fewer fired to kill. There seemed to be a natural inhibition, an empathy perhaps, preventing them from shooting directly at another human being.
A natural reluctance to kill.
Exactly. But the U.S. Army, particularly after analyzing experiences in Korea and Vietnam, became much more sophisticated in its training methods. Through innovations in training, like using realistic pop-up targets, immediate feedback, and constant repetition, they were able to significantly increase the firing rates among soldiers. They effectively trained soldiers out of some of that natural empathy or inhibition.
So training overcame a natural human tendency.
Yes. And the point the sources make is this. If we can train the humanity, the empathy out of us for certain purposes, then surely we can similarly train ourselves to make virtues stronger. We can intentionally cultivate empathy, courage, justice, prudence through similar processes of conscious practice and habit formation.
That's a powerful, if slightly chilling comparison, but it makes the point effectively. If negative traits can be trained in, positive ones can too.
That's the hopeful implication. This leads to a truly inspiring thought presented in the sources. Everyone is called to leadership.
Everyone, not just CEOs or managers.
Everyone. Not necessarily leadership through potestas, which is the power that comes from an official office or position or function, but leadership through auctoritas, which is the authority that proceeds naturally from one's character, from their integrity, wisdom, and moral standing.
Authority earned through who you are, not just the title you hold.
Exactly. In this view, leadership isn't fundamentally about rank or position. It's a way of being that is accessible to all of us, regardless of our place in society or within an organization. It's about cultivating that inner compass, those virtues, and making a positive impact through your character, right where you are.
Okay, so we've covered the fundamental values, the father framework. We've delved deep into the inner cultivation of character through virtue ethics. Now let's explore a leadership philosophy that truly puts others first. Servant leadership.
Servant leadership. Yes, this is a really influential concept.
It isn't just a modern buzzword, is it? The ideas behind it are ancient, found in many wisdom traditions. However, Robert K. Greenleaf is the person usually credited with first articulating them clearly for our modern times back in the 1970s.
That's right. It's a powerful philosophy. And it's interesting, Greenleaf himself said his own father was his original model for a servant leader. It grew from personal observation.
So how is servant leadership defined?
It's defined as a philosophy and set of practices that enriches the lives of individuals, builds better organizations, and ultimately creates a more just and caring world. That's quite a mission statement.
It is ambitious, and the crucial distinction.
The crucial distinction is that a servant leader serves first and then leads. The desire to serve is the primary motivation. Leading is secondary, a way to serve more effectively, perhaps. This is a profound shift from traditional leadership models, which often see leadership as the primary goal, and service as maybe a byproduct or not relevant at all.
It turns the traditional hierarchy on its head, doesn't it? Asking leaders to prioritize the needs, the growth, the well-being of their team above their own status or ambition.
Completely. It reframes the purpose of leadership itself.
That's such a powerful reframe. Now, Greenleaf outlined 10 principles of servant leadership. They're quite well known, but our sources really honed in on a few that fundamentally redefine leadership, concepts you might not immediately associate with traditional management, but which are seen as transformative.
Yes, let's dig into some of the key ones. One of the most important, perhaps surprisingly foundational, is listening.
Listening. That sounds basic, but I suspect it means more here.
Much more. This goes beyond just passively hearing words. It's a deep commitment to listen intently, actively, seeking to identify and clarify the will of a group, understanding not just what's said, but what's meant, what's felt.
Listening to understand, not just to reply.
Exactly, but it also encompasses something deeper. Getting in touch with one's inner voice. Understanding what one's own body, spirit, and mind are communicating. So it's about listening both outward to others and inward to your own intuition and values.
That's fascinating. Listening inward, too. Okay, what else?
Then there's empathy. Servant leaders strive to deeply understand and empathize with others, to walk a mile in their shoes, so to speak.
More than just sympathy, feeling for someone. It's feeling with them.
Yes, trying to genuinely grasp their perspective, their feelings, their experience. This means people need to be accepted and recognized for their unique spirit, their inherent worth. It's about assuming good intentions in others, even when you might have to reject or address a specific behavior or performance issue.
Seeing the person behind the action.
Precisely. It's a huge shift from a purely performance-driven transactional mindset.
Okay, listening, empathy. What's next?
Healing. This is a really profound one. Healing is described as a powerful force for transformation and integration. Servant leadership recognizes the potential for healing oneself and others.
Healing. In a workplace context, that sounds unusual.
It does, but think about it. Many people come to work carrying burdens, stresses, past hurts, maybe even trauma. Greenleaf himself noted that there is something subtle communicated to one who is being served and led if, implicit in the compact between the servant leader and led, is the understanding that the search for wholeness is something that they share.
So the leader acknowledges and supports that journey towards wholeness.
Yes. It's about fostering an environment where individuals can become whole, recognizing that people aren't just resources, they're human beings. A leader, through empathy, support, and creating a healthy environment, can contribute significantly to their restoration and well-being.
Wow, that's a high calling for a leader. And that leads naturally to awareness, perhaps.
It does. Both general awareness, understanding the context, the organization, the ethical implications, and deep self-awareness are crucial for a servant leader. You need that fundamental humility, that self-knowledge we talked about with virtue ethics.
But awareness isn't always comfortable, is it?
No, Greenleaf observed that awareness is not a giver of solace, it's just the opposite, it disturbed. True awareness can be uncomfortable, forcing you to face difficult truths about yourself, your team, or your organization. But paradoxically, it fosters inner security despite that discomfort because you're operating from a place of truth, not denial. It means facing reality head on.
Okay. Another principle that really stands out is persuasion.
Yes, persuasion is highlighted as a key differentiator. Unlike traditional leaders who might rely heavily on their positional authority, do it because I'm the boss, or on coercion or manipulation, servant leaders rely primarily on persuasion.
They convince rather than command.
Exactly. They seek to convince others, to build consensus within groups, appealing to reason and shared values rather than simply ordering compliance. It's about influence earned through trust and logic, not just power derived from rank. It demonstrates a deep respect for individual autonomy and the collective wisdom of the group.
That requires patience, I imagine.
A great deal of patience and skill in communication and relationship building.
Okay, let's jump to another critical one. Commitment to the growth of people.
This is absolutely central to servant leadership. Servant leaders believe in the intrinsic value of people beyond their tangible contributions as workers. They see people as ends in themselves, not just means to an end.
So it's not just about developing skills for the current job.
No, it's much broader. They are deeply committed to the personal, professional, and even the spiritual growth of every individual within the organization. This isn't just about job training, it's about holistic development, helping people become the best versions of themselves, realizing their full potential as human beings.
That's a profound commitment. And finally, building community.
Yes. Servant leaders recognize that in our modern world, the shift from close-knit local communities to large, often impersonal institutions has frequently created a feeling of disconnection, of loss of belonging for many people.
Alienation in the workplace.
Exactly. So servant leaders actively seek ways to build a genuine sense of community among those who work within an organization. They foster connection, collaboration, mutual support, countering that potential fragmentation, and helping people feel like they belong to something meaningful.
It's not just a place to work, but a community to be part of.
That's the ideal. These principles, our sources suggest, contribute to what they visualize using a hexagon model. Building healthy organizations. These are built on the pillars of valuing people, developing people, building community, displaying authenticity, providing leadership, and importantly, sharing leadership.
Sharing leadership, so not hoarding power.
Not at all. Empowering others is key.
So we've explored the foundational values, the importance of inner character and virtue, and this service-oriented approach of servant leadership. Now let's turn to the science behind ethical behavior. What does cutting-edge research tell us about what truly makes a leader act ethically? How does it actually work?
Well, the research points to something called leader integrity acting as a powerful catalyst for ethical leadership.
Leader integrity, how is that defined in the research?
It's defined as a commitment to acting morally and ethically and a consistent set of behaviors, beliefs, and values. It's that alignment between what a leader says they believe, what they actually believe deep down, and how they consistently behave. Word and deed matching up.
Consistency is key again.
Absolutely. It's important to distinguish this integrity from ethical leadership behavior. Ethical leadership behavior refers to the actual actions and behaviors that exemplify ethical principles. Things like treating people fairly, communicating honestly, making principled decisions. Leader integrity is the fundamental characteristic, the internal consistency that lays the groundwork for those behaviors. It's the source from which the actions flow.
That makes sense. Your integrity is your internal moral compass, and your ethical leadership behavior is how that compass guides your actions, what people actually see.
Precisely. And the research confirms a strong link. Leader integrity is seen as a fundamental characteristic that sets the foundation for ethical behavior. It builds trust, it builds credibility, and importantly, it acts as a powerful role model for others in the organization. The findings show a significant direct impact of leader integrity on ethical leadership behavior. Leaders who walk the talk are perceived as more ethical leaders.
Okay, so integrity directly leads to more ethical behavior.
Mm.
But how does that impact happen? What's the mechanism?
This is where it gets fascinating. The research suggests a key mechanism is the mediating power of moral identification.
Moral identification, what does that mean?
Think of moral identification as the degree to which being a good ethical person isn't just something you do, but something that defines who you are at your core. It's about the extent to which an individual's sense of self, their identity, is influenced by the importance they place on being moral.
So if I see honesty, compassion, fairness
Yeah.
as absolutely central to my self-identity,
Then you have strong moral identification. These values aren't just external rules you follow, they're woven into the fabric of who you believe yourself to be.
okay, I get it. And how does this connect to leader integrity?
Here's the crucial connection. A leader's integrity, their consistent ethical behavior and commitment, positively influences the moral identification of their followers.
So seeing an ethical leader makes me value being ethical more.
Exactly. It's not just about forcing compliance, it's about inspiring others to internalize these moral values, to make them part of their own identity. The research crucially indicates that moral identification mediates this relationship. It helps explain how leader integrity leads to ethical leadership behavior, particularly in followers who become leaders.
It's the bridge between the leader's integrity and the follower's ethical actions.
Yes. When followers develop a stronger moral identification, partly inspired by their leader's integrity, the impact of that leader's integrity on the follower's own subsequent ethical leadership behavior is amplified. They don't just follow the leader's example, they act ethically because it's become part of who they are. They embody the values.
That's powerful. It's about transformation, not just imitation.
Precisely. And this is especially relevant, the sources note, in sectors like healthcare, where the particular study we're drawing from was conducted. Fostering strong moral identification among healthcare workers is absolutely vital for adhering to complex ethical principles, avoiding moral distress or burnout, cultivating trust with patients and colleagues, and promoting overall well-being among staff.
It makes ethical behavior intrinsic, not just a policy.
Yes, ensuring it's a core part of their professional identity, guiding them even in the most challenging, ambiguous, high-pressure moments.
Okay, so leader integrity influences follower moral identification, which then promotes ethical behavior. What else is involved?
Another key factor is self-regulation, which seems to moderate the process.
Self-regulation. What is that exactly?
Self-regulation is basically the deliberate and conscious practice of controlling and modifying one's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. It's your capacity to manage yourself, to resist impulses, to stay focused on goals, to act in line with your values, even when faced with pressure or temptation. It's that inner strength to choose the harder right over the easier wrong.
Your ability to stick to your principles when tested.
Exactly. And the research reveals that self-regulation moderates the relationship between moral identification and ethical leadership behavior.
Moderates. How so?
It means that the positive link we just discussed, the connection between identifying strongly with moral values and actually acting ethically as a leader, is stronger for individuals who have higher levels of self-regulation.
So if I have strong moral identification and the strong self-regulation, I'm much more likely to be an ethical leader.
That's what the research suggests. People with strong self-regulation are better able to consistently translate their moral values into leadership actions. They have the internal fortitude to bridge the gap between knowing what's right, moral identification, and actually doing what's right, ethical behavior, even when it's difficult. It's about turning good intentions into consistent ethical practice.
Now, you mentioned a nuanced point from this particular study.
Yes, interestingly, in this specific study within the health sector, the moderation effect of self-regulation, while present, was unexpectedly different, somewhat less pronounced than had been found in some prior research in other contexts.
Why might that be?
Well, it highlights the importance of always considering contextual and methodological factors when interpreting and applying research findings. Things like the specific industry culture, healthcare has very strong existing professional ethics, the national culture, the specific characteristics of the sample group, all these things can influence how these psychological mechanisms play out.
So ethical behavior isn't a one-size-fits-all phenomenon across all contexts.
It seems not. What works or how strong certain factors are in one environment might need adaptation or might look slightly different in another. It's a reminder that context matters in leadership and ethics.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how does all this integrity, moral identification, self-regulation connect to broader psychological theories?
These findings align quite well with a well-known psychological framework called the theory of planned behavior, or TPB.
Theory of planned behavior. What's the gist of that?
TPB is a theory that predicts human behavior based on three key factors. First, your attitudes towards the behavior. Do you think it's good or bad? Second, subjective norms. What do you perceive important others expect you to do? And third, perceived behavioral control. How much do you believe you are capable of actually performing the behavior?
Attitude, norms, control.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How does the ethical leadership research fit in?
It slots in quite neatly. Leader integrity, demonstrated by the leader, influences the followers' attitudes, making ethical leadership seem admirable and desirable. It also shapes the subjective norms within the team or organization, creating social pressure and clear expectations around upholding moral values.
So the leader shapes what people think is good and what the group expects.
Right. Then, moral identification embodies these positive attitudes and internalized norms. It leads to the intention to act ethically because being ethical is now part of your self-concept and aligns with group expectations.
And self-regulation.
Self-regulation aligns perfectly with perceived behavioral control. It's a person's belief in their ability and their actual ability to manage themselves and overcome obstacles to act ethically. Strong self-regulation enhances an individual's capacity to effectively translate that moral identification and intention into concrete ethical leadership actions, even when facing internal temptations or external pressures.
So it's about what people believe about ethical behavior, what their peers expect of them, and whether they feel capable of acting ethically, all influenced by the leader's integrity.
Exactly. And as a leader, you're directly influencing all three of those levers through your own integrity and how you shape the environment.
So pulling all this science together, what are the actionable implications for leaders and organizations who want to foster ethical leadership? What should they actually do?
Based on this research, several clear implications emerge. First, and perhaps most obviously, cultivate leader integrity. Organizations must prioritize, select for, develop, and sustain integrity among their leaders at all levels. It has to be non-negotiable. It's the absolute bedrock.
Start at the top and ensure consistency.
Yes. Second, actively foster moral identification. Don't just issue rules. Work to build a robust ethical culture and articulate organizational values that truly resonate with your personnel, that they can connect with on a personal level. Encourage them to see honesty, fairness, compassion, service as central to their professional identity, not just a set of regulations from HR or compliance.
Make it meaningful. Make it part of who we are.
Exactly. Third, develop ethical decision-making abilities. Recognize that making ethical choices in complex situations isn't always intuitive. Provide training, workshops, mentoring, maybe even use case studies or simulations to help leaders and staff assess complex scenarios, recognize ethical dimensions, and make ethically appropriate choices. Give them the tools and the practice.
Build the skill of ethical reasoning.
Right. Fourth, promote accountability and openness. Establish clear, transparent processes for reporting ethical concerns and resolving ethical issues. Crucially, clearly communicate the consequences for unethical conduct and ensure there are safe, confidential channels for people to raise concerns without fear of reprisal. Whistleblower protection is vital.
Building trust that issues will be handled fairly.
Precisely. This builds trust that the organization is serious about ethics, creating a culture where issues can be surfaced and addressed rather than hidden or ignored.
Okay, what else?
Fifth, tailor development initiatives. Recognize that individuals differ. They have different levels of moral identification to begin with, and certainly different self-regulatory capacities. Customize leadership development programs and support initiatives accordingly. Some may need more foundational work on values clarification or building self-control, while others might be ready for more advanced ethical dilemma analysis.
Acknowledge individual differences.
Yes. And finally, number 6, encourage continuous learning and adaptation. Ethical leadership isn't a destination you arrive at. It's an ongoing journey. The ethical landscape changes, new challenges emerge. Encourage leaders and the organization as a whole to stay abreast of the latest research, to reflect on practices, to adapt, and to ensure the ethical framework remains relevant and effective in an ever-changing world.
It's a commitment to ongoing growth and refinement.
Absolutely. Much like the development of virtue itself.
Now let's take everything we've discussed, the values, the character, the service, the science, and ground it in some real-world ethical dilemmas. Our sources provide some powerful examples, specifically within the education sector.
Yes, drawing from frameworks like the Framework for Ethical Leadership in Education and guidance from the National Governance Association in the UK.
And these sources highlight how unique and profound the ethical responsibilities of educational leaders are. I mean, they aren't just managing institutions or budgets.
No, they are quite literally shaping young people into good citizens, influencing the future of society in a very direct way. The stakes feel incredibly high.
They really do. And this focus is echoed in programs like the Educational Leadership Certificate at St. Mary's University of Minnesota, which explicitly focuses on leading with virtue and cultivating character traits like prudence in judgment and moral action in school leaders.
So these aren't just abstract academic exercises for educators. They are seen as essential practical skills for navigating the daily realities and ethical complexities of running a school and serving students.
Okay, let's jump into case study 1, exam malpractice. Imagine this scenario. There's mounting pressure on schools' heads, staff, pupils' pressure coming from government targets, league tables, maybe new performance metrics like the Progress 8 scores mentioned.
Intense pressure for results.
Intense. And the sources note the malpractice penalties actually rose a staggering 149% in just 1 year. While technology like smartphones contributes to student malpractice, there's also a serious worry that this pressure causes bad practice from staff. Things like giving students too much help, bending exam rules, maybe even altering marks to boost scores.
A slippery slope driven by external pressure.
Exactly. So the ethical tension here is profound. How does a school leader balance that intense pressure for best possible outcomes with the absolute need for fair, ethical, and accountable exam conduct?
It's a classic conflict between outcome pressure and process integrity.
And our sources rightly remind us that exams are not the sole purpose of education. Schools have to balance progress monitoring with the fundamental duty of safeguarding of children, which includes protecting them from undue stress and pressure.
So what are the proposed solutions or approaches?
The key things mentioned are having crystal clear policies to identify and deter malpractice by both students and staff, robust whistleblower policies so people feel safe raising concerns, clear training for everyone involved, and clear routes for escalating concerns when they arise.
Putting safeguards in place. How does this scenario test the frameworks we've discussed?
Well, it deeply tests principles like honesty and accountability from our Father framework, doesn't it? Are we being honest about results? Are we holding ourselves accountable to the rules?
Absolutely. And what about virtue?
I'm curious, what role does courage play here for staff? Especially if they see a colleague, maybe even a superior, engaged in questionable practices around exams. That takes real guts to speak up.
Immense courage. Reporting concerns upwards, especially against pressure to conform or look the other way, requires significant moral courage. An ethically led school creates a culture where that courage is not just allowed, but actively supported and even celebrated, where doing the right thing is valued more than just getting the right score.
And how does ensuring fair exams contribute to what the framework calls optimism for pupils growing into good citizens? Because if the system feels rigged, if cheating seems necessary or condoned,
What does that teach them about fairness and integrity in the wider world? It's a critical point. If exams aren't conducted ethically, it undermines students' belief in a just system. It can teach them that results matter more than integrity, that the ends justify the means. That's the very opposite of fostering optimism for being a good citizen. Fair exams demonstrate that integrity matters, that rules apply equally, that hard work is valued, crucial lessons for life.
a tough one for sure. Okay, moving to case study 2. Pupil behavior, specifically the zero-tolerance approach.
Behavior, always a challenging area in schools.
The dilemma for leaders, as presented, is the huge responsibility they have to model a good society by maintaining an orderly, happy, and safe school environment. Good behavior makes learning possible, and for some children, especially those from chaotic, neglectful, cruel, or violent homes, a calm, predictable school environment can be absolutely life-changing.
A sanctuary.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, the source warns, if recovery from mistakes is made impossible, if there's no room for error or second chances, these very same vulnerable children can find themselves living on a cliff edge of rejection, potentially compounding the trauma or instability they experience at home.
A very fine line to walk.
So the scenario presents a leader, maybe a new head teacher, in a disadvantaged community who implements very strict rules, immaculate uniform enforced rigidly, silence in corridors, absolute zero tolerance for even minor infractions. They expect parents to sign up to this regime or face their child being excluded.
A hard line. What's the rationale?
The leader believes the compliant majority of students deserve an orderly school and that any defiance, however small, cannot be tolerated as it undermines the system for everyone. The question posed bluntly is, are you right?
Wow. That forces a deep ethical reflection.
It does. And the ethical insight offered is powerful. All behavior is a language of communication. Instead of just reacting to the surface behavior, leaders need warm and strong professional relationships, highly skilled teaching, robust support services, and intelligent, informed reflection to understand what the behavior is actually communicating. Every child, the source argues, deserves an adult willing to try and interpret their language. Shortcuts like zero tolerance, though tempting for creating surface order, are ultimately detrimental.
So this leader believes they're creating necessary order, serving the compliant majority. But the source pushes back, saying all behavior is a language. How do you even begin to reconcile that deep, understandable need for order and safety with the ethical imperative to understand and support every child, especially those whose language might be disruptive because of trauma or unmet needs?
It's the core tension, isn't it? And our courage and certainty are the same thing in behavior management, because the zero-tolerance approach often presents itself as strong, decisive, maybe even courageous.
But it might just be rigid, inflexible, and ultimately lacking in deeper courage.
How so?
Well, our sources, and virtue ethics generally, would suggest that true courage in this context might actually be found in the willingness to do the harder work. The work of building relationships, understanding the root causes of challenging behavior, and implementing nuanced, supportive, sometimes individualized strategies, rather than resorting to the seemingly easier but potentially harmful option of simply excluding children who don't fit the mold.
The courage to be compassionate and flexible, rather than just enforcing rules.
Exactly. A zero-tolerance policy, while perhaps creating immediate superficial order, can deeply harm the most vulnerable students. It can perpetuate cycles of exclusion, reinforce feelings of rejection, and deny children the very safety, consistency, and supportive relationships they desperately need to learn and thrive. It arguably fails the empathy and healing tests of servant leadership because it prioritizes compliance over understanding and human development.
And ultimately, does it help these young people grow into good citizens?
It's hard to see how. If the main lesson learned is that mistakes lead to rejection, that support isn't available when you struggle, that doesn't seem to foster the optimism or resilience needed for active, positive citizenship. It might teach compliance through fear, but not necessarily internal goodness or responsibility.
That one really hits home. Okay, let's move to a different type of ethical challenge involving resources. Case study 3, focusing on curriculum decisions.
Ah, the curriculum, what the students actually learn, huge implications.
And a huge cost. The source notes the curriculum is often the single largest cost for a school, and it's obviously the central function. Taxpayers expect schools to deliver a core of knowledge and skills.
So there's accountability for both cost and content.
Right, the scenario. An 11 to 16 school, with results described as just okay, and experiencing some staff turnover.
To meet compulsory government targets for the EBAC, a specific suite of academic subjects, by 2024, the school's leadership decides to focus heavily on just 8 core academic subjects. They give English and math large chunks of timetable allocation, prioritizing the core academics for the performance metrics.
Exactly. But the consequence is that arts and practical subjects are put on a short carousel in KS3, early secondary years, mainly to save money, and this severely limits student choice later on in KS4, exam years. The question again is, are you right?
Another tough trade-off.
Yes. The ethical tension is clear. Accountability pressures and funding realities are driving these curriculum decisions. However, the source emphasizes that the curriculum is more than assessment. Examinations are part of it, but not its sole purpose. Education should also instill the value of learning as an end in itself and persistence as a desirable character trait.
So narrowing the curriculum to meet targets might undermine broader educational goals.
That's the concern. How do virtues like objectivity, justice, and service virtues mentioned in the NGA framework apply here? How do leaders objectively balance budget needs and targets against the goal of providing a broad, enriching curriculum for all students? Is it just to narrow opportunities, potentially disproportionately affecting students who thrive in non-EBAC subjects? Who are we truly serving?
And connecting to other frameworks. Does such a narrow focus align with the conceptualization or foresight principles of servant leadership? Are we thinking broadly about the long-term development of students or just meeting short-term metrics?
Good question. And how does a narrowed curriculum affect students' optimism for their future growth as well-rounded citizens? Does it limit their horizons, their discovery of talents outside the core academic subjects?
These curriculum decisions have deep ethical ripples affecting student opportunity, motivation, and their whole perception of what education is for. It forces leaders to confront fundamental questions about the purpose of schooling.
Definitely. Now let's look at case study 4, which has two parts, both concerning the use of public funds and supporting vulnerable pupils.
Money and vulnerability always ethically charged.
The core responsibility here is stark. School leaders manage significant public investment. They must ensure funds are spent as Parliament intends on the education of children and young people. This requires high standards of probity and transparency.
Stewardship of public money.
Exactly. So scenario part 1. A new pupil arrives mid-year with significant learning and communication needs. They are placed in an already packed class, 29 pupils, 3 of whom already have official support plans, EHCPs, and one of those needs dedicated one-to-one support. The teacher, a newly qualified teacher, NQT, feels completely overwhelmed. The new child is disruptive, isn't making progress, the parents are complaining daily, and now the child is refusing to attend school. The school's Special Educational Needs Coordinator, SE&Co, says they have no spare staff they can redeploy to help. The question, how would you proceed?
A nightmare scenario for everyone involved: the child, the teacher, the parents, the leader.
And the ethical context provided is critical. Research consistently shows that practices like attainment grouping, setting, or streaming students by perceived ability disproportionately disadvantage pupils from low socioeconomic backgrounds and some minority ethnic groups.
How so?
It often leads to these students experiencing less progress, receiving poor resourcing, facing low expectations from staff, and being taught by less expert teaching staff compared to higher sets. The principle stated is that all children have a right to teaching and curricula which are stimulating and stretching, and equal access to high-quality, subject expert provision.
So simply moving the struggling child to a lower group might not be an ethical solution, even if it seems easier.
Exactly. The source implies a social justice perspective. Disadvantaged children often need additional help and resources, but common practices like streaming can have the opposite effect. This situation directly tests the NGA virtue of service. Who's your first responsibility to hear? The overwhelmed teacher, the complaining parents, the struggling child, the rest of the class. It tests justice. How do you ensure equal opportunity and adequate support for all children, especially most vulnerable, within finite resources? And it tests courage, the courage to face this incredibly difficult situation and make hard decisions, rather than avoiding it or opting for a quick fix that might harm the child long term.
It's a classic ethical dilemma of balancing competing needs and rights with severely limited resources. The easiest solution might be to find a way to move the child, maybe to a different class or even suggest a different school. But as the context highlights, that could perpetuate inequities or simply pass the problem elsewhere.
So what would a more ethical approach look like, drawing on our frameworks?
An ethical leader, guided perhaps by the empathy and potential for healing principles from servant leadership, wouldn't just look for the quickest fix. They'd try to understand the situation from all perspectives: the child's, the teacher's, the parents'. They would explore creative solutions. Could existing resources be reallocated differently, even temporarily? Is there external support they could fight for? Could they work collaboratively with the parents, the teacher, maybe even the wider school community to find a sustainable solution within the school?
It requires moving beyond immediate crisis management to innovative, collaborative, child-centered problem solving.
Yes, rather than just moving the perceived problem or simply letting the NQT burn out, which is also unethical. It requires that practical wisdom, that prudence, to find the best possible path forward in a very constrained reality.
Okay, now scenario part 2 of case study 4. Senior leader pay. Sticking with the theme of using public funds ethically.
Always a sensitive topic.
Imagine the governing board is considering awarding a 25% recruitment and retention allowance to a senior leader. This is on top of their regular salary. The question is posed, is that right? And should that be the full 25% allowable? And also, what should you as a governor or leader involved do with this information?
This immediately raises a whole host of ethical considerations, doesn't it?
It does. The NGA framework prompts reflection using its own set of principles, which overlap significantly with the father principles and virtues we discussed. Questions like,
Gone.
selflessness. Is this decision being made solely for the benefit of the children and young people in the school? Or are other motives potentially at play? Integrity. Are the right people making this decision, free from conflicts of interest or undue influence? Is the process sound? Objectivity. Is there robust, objective evidence demonstrating the need for such a significant allowance to recruit or retain this specific post? Is it benchmarked fairly?
Evidence, not just opinion.
Exactly. Accountability.
Yeah.
Is this demonstrably the best use of public money? How would this decision stand up to external scrutiny from auditors, the Department for Education, or taxpayers? Openness. Would the school be comfortable publishing its senior pay policy, including these allowances? Could they confidently justify this specific decision to parents, staff, or even local journalists if asked?
The transparency test.
Yes. And honesty. Is the board being fully transparent with itself and with staff about how leadership pay is determined and the rationale behind specific decisions? This whole scenario clearly ties into the broader principles of fairness and accountability from the father framework. Is it fair to other staff? Is it accountable to the public purse?
And it strongly connects to the stewardship principle of servant leadership, which emphasizes that leaders hold their institutions in trust for the greater good of society. Is spending potentially scarce funds on a large executive bonus the best way to serve that greater good compared to, say, hiring another teaching assistant or funding resources for vulnerable pupils like the one in the previous scenario?
It forces a very direct confrontation with competing priorities and the responsible use of limited public funds. There might be legitimate reasons for such an allowance in some cases, but the ethical frameworks demand rigorous justification, transparency, and a primary focus on the benefit to students.
Absolutely. The process and the justification are paramount.
Finally, let's look at case study 5, teacher workload. This is a huge issue in education.
Huge and deeply ethical when you consider the impact on both teachers and students.
The source calls teachers a school's biggest asset and its biggest cost. It paints a picture of young graduates entering the profession filled with zeal to help children and change the world. But retaining them is a major challenge. Losing experienced, committed teachers is described as a seriously risky democratic deficit, a loss for society.
A powerful framing. Why do they leave?
According to the source, teachers primarily quit for 3 reasons: challenging pupil behavior, pay, though often not the main driver, and crucially, workload. But not just the volume of work, specifically workload related to practices and requirements for which they can see no justification in improved service to children. Bureaucracy, pointless paperwork.
Exactly. Things perceived as being about compliance with planning and assessment burdens that don't seem to actually help kids learn better. That kind of workload feels particularly demoralizing and disrespectful of their professionalism.
I can understand that. So the scenario.
A new head teacher takes over a struggling school. Staff recruitment is difficult. The existing staff are fragmented into 3 incompatible groups, perhaps veterans resistant to change, newcomers feeling overwhelmed, and a middle group caught between. The core question posed to the new head is how they can stop, listen, reflect, change their teachers' working life, and save them in the profession for the long term. A massive leadership challenge rooted in ethical care for the staff.
Definitely. How do the frameworks help here? The NGA framework connects this to courage. How does a leader have the courage to talk openly and honestly with all staff groups about the sensitive issues of workload, morale, and division? And it connects to optimism. How can the leader help the school community recover from past struggles and greet the future with renewed hope and purpose, built on supporting its key asset, the teachers?
And servant leadership seems incredibly relevant here.
Absolutely. This scenario speaks directly to core servant leadership principles, like listening really deeply, listening to understand the teacher's frustrations and suggestions. Empathy, genuinely understanding the pressures they face. Commitment to the growth of people, valuing teachers and investing in their well-being and professional sustainability, not just burning them out. And building community, finding ways to heal the divisions between staff groups and foster a collaborative, supportive culture.
Ultimately, the ethical imperative is for the leader to serve their primary assets, the teachers, so that they, in turn, can best serve the students. Addressing unnecessary workload isn't just about efficiency, it's about respecting teachers' time, professionalism, and well-being, which is fundamentally an ethical act of leadership.
We have covered so much ground today. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. From foundational principles to deep character work to practical philosophies and cutting-edge science, and then seeing it all play out in those tough real-world scenarios.
Let's try to synthesize the key takeaways. We started by laying the foundational principles of ethical leadership, exploring that helpful father framework with its emphasis on core values like fairness, accountability, trust, honesty, equality, and respect, remembering that it's about doing the right things the right way.
Then we delved into the crucial inner dimension, the cultivation of character through virtue ethics. Understanding how virtues like prudence, practical wisdom, courage, justice, self-mastery, and that foundational humility, self-knowledge, aren't just innate traits, but habits we actively develop and refine through practice and emulation.
And we didn't stop there. We examined the outward-focused practices of servant leadership, guided by Robert Greenleaf's powerful principles like deep listening, empathy, healing, persuasion, and that fundamental commitment to the growth of people, all aimed at putting the well-being and development of others first.
We also explored the science behind it all, looking at how leader integrity acts as a catalyst, fundamentally shaping ethical behavior. We saw how this influence is mediated through fostering moral identification in followers, making ethics part of their identity, and how the ability to translate values into action is moderated by individual self-regulation, all fitting within the broader theory of planned behavior.
Finally, we saw how these sometimes abstract-sounding ideas come vividly alive in the concrete, often messy, high-stakes challenges faced by educational leaders in our case studies, grappling with exam pressures, complex student behavior, tough curriculum choices, the responsible use of public funds, supporting vulnerable children, and tackling teacher workload.
It really shows how these frameworks aren't just theoretical. They offer practical guidance for navigating incredibly complex ethical terrain.
So for you listening, remember that being a learner means gaining a shortcut to being well-informed. We hope you now feel equipped with a richer, more nuanced framework to analyze ethical dilemmas not just in large organizations or schools, but in your own daily interactions, your own decisions, whatever your role may be. This deep dive should leave you with a clearer understanding of what it truly means to lead and to live with integrity and purpose.
It's an ongoing process for all of us, isn't it? This cultivation of ethical awareness and practice.
It really is. Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to take away. If, as our sources compellingly suggest, leaders are trained, not born, and if excellence is not an act but a habit,
Then the power to change and grow lies within each of us.
exactly. So the question to leave you with is this. What specific, small, virtuous habit will you begin to cultivate, starting today, to strengthen your own ethical leadership, your own character, no matter your current role or position?